The summer of 2001 was not remembered for fireworks or parades in the small Midwestern town of Ashford Hollow, Indiana. It was remembered for the drought. The Ashford River, which for generations had cut a silver ribbon through the valley, shrank back from its banks until mud cracked like parched skin. What the river revealed, that July stunned the town into silence, and eventually the entire state. Beneath the sediment, just where the shoreline bent near the old iron railway bridge, two human skulls emerged from the earth, as if the river had grown tired of keeping its secrets. A county work crew, sent to clear debris from the exposed riverbed, had been joking about finding bottles or old wagon wheels when the blade of a shovel struck something solid. At first, the worker thought it was a stone, but as he brushed the mud away with his boot, he saw empty sockets staring back at him. By the time the sheriff arrived, the skeletons were half visible, tangled with rusted lengths of electrical cord and the smooth, heavy stones that had once kept them submerged. For Ashford Hollow, the discovery was not just grisly. It was familiar. Older residents whispered immediately of Clara and June Holloway, the sisters who had vanished on a hot Sunday afternoon in 1936 and had never been found. Some of the townsfolk had been children themselves back then, holding lanterns as their parents searched the woods. They remembered the prayers at the church, the posters nailed to telephone poles, and the way the Holloway house grew darker with each passing year. Now, 65 years later, the river had decided to speak. Before we unravel the truth of what happened to Clara and June, I invite you to reflect on a question. Do you believe the truth can ever really be buried forever, or does it always find a way to the surface? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to follow stories like this, tales of long-forgotten mysteries finally seeing daylight, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss what comes next. Because this is not just a story of two missing girls. It is the story of a town that turned its head, of a family that lived behind closed doors, and of secrets strong enough to last through wars, decades, and generations, until the river itself grew weary of silence. The bones in the riverbank marked not only the end of a mystery, but the beginning of an investigation that would stretch across time, from the Great Depression to the dawn of the new millennium. It is a journey into dusty police files, fading photographs, and diary pages written in a teenager's looping hand. It is a journey that asks how far control can extend, how silence protects the guilty, and how truth, though delayed, can never be denied. The river gave up its secret in 2001. But to understand what it revealed, we must go back to the last Sunday the Holloway sisters were seen alive. The Sunday of the 19th of July, 1936, began the way most Sundays did in Ashford Hollow. The bells of Street Mary's struck 9, their bronze voices carrying across the valley and bouncing off the walls of the modest homes that lined Main Street. Families emerged from clapboard houses in their best clothes, hats pulled low against the rising Sunday. The Great Depression had spared no one in this town of fewer than 3,000. Yet Sunday morning was the one time when shoes were polished, collars were pressed, and every family tried to present itself as untouched by hardship. The Holloway family was no exception. Clara, at 19, carried her worn Bible against her chest, as though it might guard her from everything she could not name aloud. She had finished school the year before, though money had kept her from enrolling at the normal college she dreamed of attending. Her plan, she told friends, was to teach children, to give them more than she herself had been given. With her auburn hair pinned back neatly and her chin raised just slightly, Clara had the quiet dignity of someone older than her years. Her sister June trailed at her side, 16, and still restless. June was quicker with laughter, quicker with questions, and quicker to notice that their father Gerald's eyes lingered on them too often. Measuring, assessing. She had confided to a friend at school that she sometimes wished Clara would run away and take her along. June had inherited their mother Margaret's honey-blonde hair and her tendency to wring her hands when anxious, though on this Sunday, her smile was wide as she hummed along with the hymn the congregation sang. After the service, the Holloways walked home together along Sycamore Street. Margaret carried the picnic basket she had packed that morning, cold ham slices, bread, and 2 jars of homemade pickles. Gerald walked a few paces ahead, silent except for an occasional cough from too many years at the sawmill. Clara and June lagged behind, whispering to each other about their plan for the afternoon. They wanted to ride their bicycles down to the Ashford River, to the spot where cottonwoods leaned out over the water. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could dip their feet, share secrets, and, for a while, forget the heaviness that lived inside their home. By early afternoon, the heat had become nearly unbearable. The cicadas buzzed as though the air itself were splitting open. In their upstairs bedroom, Clara and June changed out of their Sunday dresses and into cotton skirts and blouses. Posters of film stars Clark Gable and Jean Harlow watched from the peeling wallpaper as the sisters packed towels into a satchel. June grabbed the small portable radio their neighbor had loaned them, proud to own something that made her feel modern, connected to the outside world. A neighbor across the street, Mrs. Larkin, later told police she saw the two girls pushing their bicycles toward the dirt path that led to the river. They looked happy, she recalled in her statement, like any girls would on a hot summer day. She had waved to them, but the girls did not see her. They were laughing at something only they understood, their voices carrying faintly until the sound was swallowed by the cicadas. That was the last time anyone in Ashford Hollow saw Clara and June Holloway alive. Back at the house, Margaret set the table for supper. She expected the girls to return by 6, hungry from swimming. When the clock struck 7, she began to pace. By 8, she stood at the front porch, scanning the dirt road for the gleam of bicycle rims. At 9, she walked to the corner store and asked if anyone had seen her daughters. No one had. The store clerk remembered only the sound of the radio drifting from the Holloway house earlier in the day. By the time Gerald returned from the tavern just before 10, Margaret was already trembling with fear. She told him the girls had not come home. Gerald, reeking of whiskey and sawdust, tightened his jaw and said nothing for a long moment. Finally, he muttered, "They'll turn up." But the muscles in his face betrayed something else, something like knowledge or dread. The July night settled heavily over Ashford Hollow, and the town did not yet know that 2 of its daughters had walked into history. The Holloway home was never truly dark that night. Margaret kept every lamp burning, as though light itself could guide her daughters back to the porch. By 11 o'clock, she had gone to the police station, her apron still tied around her waist, her hair frayed loose from its bun. Sheriff Charles Dwyer, a man known for his calm demeanor, listened as she stumbled through the story. 2 girls, gone since afternoon. Towels, bicycles, a portable radio. None of it returned. Dwyer knew the Holloway name carried weight in town. Gerald was a long-time worker at the Ashford sawmill, and Margaret was one of the few women still keeping the church's charity accounts in order during the Depression years. But Clara and June, those girls had been fixtures in Sunday school, in the choir, on the dusty main street. Dwyer wasted little time. By midnight, he had roused 3 deputies and a group of townsmen willing to search. Lanterns bobbed like fireflies along the path to the river. The night air was thick with insects, and every rustle of brush made the searchers stop to listen. Near the cottonwood grove, they found the first sign: 2 bicycles leaning against the tree line, as though carefully placed. Beside them lay a folded blanket, damp from the river's edge, and a tin of biscuits half eaten. The portable radio, its dial faintly glowing, had burned through its battery, but there was no sign of Clara or June. Gerald arrived at the scene shortly after, his boots sinking into the mud. Witnesses later recalled that his face was pale in the lantern light, his shirt unbuttoned halfway, as though he had left the tavern in a hurry. He stood silently for a long time, staring at the bicycles, then muttered, "They must have wandered upriver." When a deputy suggested dragging the river at dawn, Gerald nodded too quickly, as though agreeing before anyone had asked. By 2 in the morning, the search expanded. Farmers came from their fields, carrying shotguns and lanterns, as though expecting to confront some wild animal. Dogs were brought in but grew restless, unable to keep a trail beyond the grove. The women of the town gathered at the Holloway porch, comforting Margaret, who clutched her daughter's shawls against her chest. "It isn't like them," she whispered again and again. "Clara would never stay out so late. June would have called to me." But there were no telephones in the grove, no way to call across the darkness. The following morning, July 20, the Ashford Gazette printed a hastily typeset headline: 2 Holloway sisters missing by river. Their school portraits, one taken at the end of term, appeared beneath. The girls' faces stared out, Clara solemn and thoughtful, June restless and smiling. Copies were tacked to every post office wall, pinned to the church doors, and displayed in the windows of the grocer's and the drugstore. Tips came quickly. fueled by rumor as much as memory. A farmer claimed to have seen a dark truck on the dirt road near the river. 3 boys swore they had heard a scream, though they admitted later they had been drinking cider stolen from a cellar. A traveling salesman, stopping in town for gas, told deputies he thought he had seen 2 young women walking along the highway, but when pressed, he could not recall if it had been that day or the week before. Inside the sheriff's office, the deputies logged each call by hand, the ink staining their fingers. They marked a map of Ashford Hollow with pins, red for places searched, blue for reported sightings. Within 2 days, the map looked like a battlefield, but the sisters themselves were nowhere to be found. As the hours passed, the mood shifted from urgency to dread. On the second night, men dragged the river with hooks and nets. They found nothing but driftwood and silt. On the third day, a group of women searching the woods stumbled upon a shoe, brown leather, small, with a buckle. Margaret recognized it instantly as June's. It lay half buried near the bend in the river, not far from the bicycles. The discovery sent a tremor through the town. Whispers grew louder. Abduction, foul play, something worse. Parents kept their children indoors. Shopkeepers closed early. Every stranger was regarded with suspicion. Gerald, for his part, presented himself as a grieving father, but some noticed peculiarities. He joined the search only after being prompted. He seemed to know where to look, moving directly toward the grove, toward the very place the girls' belongings were later found. And though he spoke little, those who watched him closely swore they caught glimpses of something not grief, but fear. Fear not of loss, but of discovery. By the end of that first week, the search parties dwindled. The river gave no answers, the woods no clues. The Holloway sisters had vanished into history, and though the town's heart broke, life in Ashford Hollow was forced, painfully, to move on. Oh, the sisters. Headlines shifted from 2 girls missing after Sunday swim to no leads in Holloway mystery. A photograph of Margaret at her front porch, clutching June's shawl, appeared above the fold. Her face was pale, almost translucent in the grainy print, and readers said it looked as if grief itself had carved her features into stone. Sheriff Dwyer, though earnest, was overwhelmed. He had 4 deputies, no access to state investigators, and equipment that would have been considered outdated even a decade earlier. Blood typing was rudimentary, fingerprints nearly impossible to collect outdoors, and the idea of preserving crime scenes was little more than a suggestion. Evidence was bagged in paper envelopes, sometimes without labels. Deputies trudged mud into the office, mixing river silt with cigarette ash on the floor. Rumors filled the void left by absent answers. Some swore they saw a circus caravan passing on the highway the day of the disappearance and convinced themselves the sisters had been lured away by entertainers. Others insisted a drifter had been spotted near the sawmill, a man with a torn coat and eyes that didn't meet yours. A few whispered darker things that the sisters had chosen to run away, that perhaps they had secrets no one had wanted to speak aloud. On the 3rd Sunday after the disappearance, the church bell rang again, but not for worship. The congregation gathered for a vigil. Candles flickered in the heavy July air as the Reverend offered prayers for Clara and June. Mothers held their children closer, and fathers stood in silence, hats in hand, their faces grave. The hymn sung that evening was not one of joy but of supplication, a plea for the safe return of 2 daughters. Yet beneath the solemnity, doubts grew. People had begun to ask questions not only about strangers, but about those closest to the girls. Why had Gerald known where to look for the bicycles? Why did he always volunteer to search upriver alone? And why did Margaret, usually outspoken, grow silent whenever her husband entered the room? Still, no one dared to accuse directly. In the 1,930 seconds, family reputations were guarded like heirlooms, and the Holloways, despite their modest means, were respected in church and factory alike. The thought of scandal, especially tied to a family so woven into the fabric of Ashford Hollow, was unbearable to many. It was easier to blame outsiders, to imagine that evil had come from beyond their town limits. By August, the search effort waned. The river continued to give nothing back. The fields needed tending, and the depression offered no mercy for lost time. Sheriff Dwyer filed the case as open but inactive. The Holloway file a thin folder of handwritten statements, a few grainy photographs, and a single buckle from June's shoe was placed in a cabinet in the courthouse basement. Dust settled over it before the year was out. Margaret continued to set 2 extra places at the dinner table, though Gerald often returned late from the tavern and ate in silence. She told neighbors she still listened for the squeak of bicycle tires on the road at dusk. The house grew quiet. So quiet that even the ticking clock seemed too loud. In truth, Ashford Hollow had already begun to forget, or perhaps not forget, but bury. The town folded the tragedy into its history, into whispered warnings and half-remembered tales. The sisters' faces remained in yearbooks, in a photograph displayed on a piano, in the fading memories of classmates. But the urgency drained away, leaving only a wound no one dared probe. The search had yielded nothing. Not the sisters, not the truth, not even a suspect. Only silence, and the kind of silence that would last for decades. By the first autumn after the Holloway sisters' disappearance, the story had shifted from urgent to haunting. The Ashford Gazette continued to print headlines, though each one sounded more desperate than the last. No trace of Clara. And June after 2 months, sheriff pleads for information. The black ink of the type bled across cheap paper, smudging the hands of anyone who read too quickly. For weeks, the sisters' photographs, school portraits taken only months earlier, stared out from windows and bulletin boards. But even photographs can lose their sharpness when eyes grow accustomed to them. For a time, the town insisted the culprit must have been a stranger. It couldn't have been one of us, people said over counters and across pews. Theories bloomed like weeds: a passing salesman, a drifter from Chicago, a rail worker no one could name. The Gazette published interviews with farmers who claimed to have seen unfamiliar footprints in their fields. A group of teenagers swore they saw a man in a wide-brimmed hat near the riverbank on the very afternoon the sisters vanished. But none of these details led anywhere, and none of them could be verified. As the weeks turned to months, the tone of the newspaper changed. What had once been bold headlines became small columns buried inside, next to articles about crop yields or debates in the town council. By Christmas, the Gazette ran its last full story on the Holloways for the year. A quiet piece titled, "A Family Waits for News." The waiting defined Margaret Holloway. Every morning she swept the porch, as though preparing for her daughters to return at any moment. She placed their school books neatly on the parlor shelf, dusted their photographs, and folded their dresses, which remained in the wardrobe long after the styles had gone out of fashion. Neighbors would stop by with bread or casseroles, but Margaret spoke less and less. Her eyes seemed fixed on some horizon no one else could see. Gerald, meanwhile, grew more withdrawn. He claimed long hours at the sawmill, but many saw him slumped over a glass at the tavern. When asked about the girls, he responded curtly, his answers clipped and rehearsed. "They'll be found," he would say, and then order another drink. Yet those closest to the family noticed how sharply he snapped at Margaret whenever she mentioned the search, how his hands shook when their names were spoken aloud. Whispers circulated, not loud accusations, but murmurs carried in kitchens and churchyards. Some recalled Gerald's temper, others his controlling ways with the girls. But in a town bound tightly by propriety and fear of scandal, no one dared to voice suspicion openly. It was easier to maintain the story of the faceless stranger, the nameless drifter. Evil, people told themselves, had come from outside Ashford Hollow, not from within it. At the church, the Reverend dedicated a portion of every Sunday service to prayer for the missing. Candles were lit, hymns sung in softer tones, children were reminded not to wander far, and parents kept closer watch. For a time, the sisters' absence served as both tragedy and cautionary tale. But time is a powerful eraser. By the following spring, a new story occupied the Gazette's front page. The construction of a new grain elevator, promising jobs. The Holloways were pushed further back into memory, their names appearing only on the anniversary of their disappearance. Each year, Margaret would organize a vigil at the riverbank, sometimes drawing dozens of townspeople, sometimes only a handful. She lit 2 white candles, let them drift on the current, and watched until the flames sputtered out. It was said that Margaret never truly spoke of hope, only of waiting. "They are near," she would whisper to those who came. "I feel it in my bones." Her voice was calm, but her eyes betrayed the cost of holding on so long. Ashford Hollow adjusted. Children grew up, the Depression gave way to war, and life insisted on moving forward. But in quiet corners, in the stillness of night, the town carried the Holloway sisters like a ghost story. Their faces lingered in memory, not as a mystery solved, but as a question suspended, unanswered. The Gazette eventually relegated them to a single line in the 10 years ago column. Still no word on missing sisters, Clara and June Holloway. It was a small reminder that the past was not finished with the town, even if the town was finished with the past. By the second year without Clara and June, the Holloway household had become a place of whispers and shadows. Neighbors who visited described the house as perpetually dim, curtains drawn even on bright mornings. Margaret still moved through each room, as though her daughters might return at any moment. She set out 2 plates at supper, kept their beds neatly made, and folded their dresses as if they might be worn again. To her, time had stopped on that July afternoon, and she refused to let it carry her forward. Every evening, she sat on the porch in her rocking chair, gazing down Sycamore Street, as though expecting bicycle wheels to appear at the end of the lane. When children passed, their laughter reminded her of June's voice, and she often found herself rising, heart pounding, only to realize it was someone else's daughter. One day, she told herself aloud, as though by speaking it she might make it true. Gerald responded to grief differently. He spent longer hours at the sawmill, volunteering for night shifts that no one else wanted. When he did return home, it was often after a stop at the tavern, his boots heavy, his eyes glassy. He ate in silence, never touching the plates Margaret had set for the missing girls. If Margaret mentioned their names, he would slam his fist against the table or retreat into wordless brooding. To outsiders, Gerald remained the same stoic figure he had always been. In church, he bowed his head, his large hands folded neatly. At the tavern, he nodded politely at acquaintances before settling into his corner. Yet those closest to him noticed the cracks. His temper flared without warning, his drinking grew heavier, and his presence in the search efforts dwindled until he no longer participated at all. Meanwhile, the town's vigils changed shape. The first anniversary had drawn nearly the entire population of Ashford Hollow. Hundreds lined the banks of the river, candles glowing against the summer dusk, hymns echoing softly. Margaret had stood at the center, her face lit by candlelight, her hands trembling as she thanked each neighbor. Gerald stood beside her, stiff, eyes downcast. By the 3rd year, the numbers dwindled. Only 50 people came, mostly family, friends, and church members. The Gazette ran a short column noting the vigil, but the headline was buried beneath news of crop prices and a new school opening. By the 5th year, fewer than a dozen gathered. Margaret still lit 2 candles and placed them gently on the river's surface, watching the flames drift into the darkness. Gerald did not attend that year. He claimed work at the mill, though it was Sunday evening. Neighbors who passed the tavern swore they saw him sitting alone, hunched over a glass. Margaret's faith became both her anchor and her burden. She spent hours in the church, polishing candlesticks, arranging flowers, and kneeling until her knees ached. She prayed aloud, not only for Clara and June, but for strength to endure the silence. When asked if she still believed her daughters were alive, she only replied, "The Lord sees what we do not." It was not hope exactly, but something harder, something unyielding. At home, silence thickened. The once lively chatter of the sisters' bedroom was replaced by the ticking of the hallway clock. Margaret sometimes opened the wardrobe just to breathe in the faint scent of lavender soap from their dresses. She wrote letters to her daughters that she never mailed, tucking them into the Bible on her nightstand. In those letters, she described the weather, the neighbors, even the sound of birds in the morning. She signed each one, "With all my love, Mother." Gerald found no such rituals. He buried himself in labor and drink, yet the tension between him and Margaret deepened. Their conversations grew short, their dinners strained. The grief that might have bound them instead divided them, and though no one in town dared say it aloud, there were those who began to suspect that Gerald's silence was not grief, but guilt. Still, Margaret endured. Through whispered gossip, through dwindling vigils, through the long years of absence, she carried her daughters in every gesture, every ritual, every breath. The family was broken, yet she refused to surrender completely to despair. Ashford Hollow, however, had moved on. By the 1942, the war in Europe dominated headlines. Young men from the town marched off to enlist, and factories roared to life again. The Holloway sisters' photographs yellowed in scrapbooks. Their names faded to little more than a cautionary tale. Only in the dim light of the Holloway home did their presence remain vivid, a constant reminder that grief, unlike memory, does not fade so easily. By the time the 1942 arrived, Ashford Hollow's attention had shifted. The war in Europe consumed the nation's thoughts, and soon young men from the town were enlisting, marching off with crisp uniforms and nervous smiles. The Gazette, once filled with speculation about Clara and June Holloway, now brimmed with casualty lists, bond drives, and victory gardens. The war brought both grief and purpose, and in that surge of history, the story of two missing sisters seemed smaller, less urgent. For Margaret, the silence grew heavier with each passing year. The church bells rang not for her daughters, but for sons lost overseas. Mothers like her wept on porches, though for different reasons. In public, she carried herself with dignity, her hair now streaked with grey, her hands lined from years of prayer. In private, she still wrote letters to Clara and June, slipping them between the pages of her Bible, as though the words might one day reach them through some unseen hand. Gerald, meanwhile, found convenient cover in the war effort. He worked double shifts at the sawmill, which supplied lumber for crates and barracks. His long hours and late nights no longer raised eyebrows. Everyone was busy. Everyone was exhausted. If he drank more than before, no one noticed in the crowded taverns where men gathered to discuss ration books and headlines from overseas. By the late 1942, the Holloway case had become something closer to folklore. Children whispered about the sisters when daring each other to walk alone to the riverbank. If you go after sundown, they warned, you'll hear Clara calling your name. Parents repeated the story as a cautionary tale. Don't wander far. Don't talk to strangers. Don't stray from the path. The details blurred over time. Some swore the girls had been taken by a traveling carnival. Others insisted they had drowned. The truth, whatever it was, lay buried under layers of rumor and imagination. In the courthouse basement, the case file gathered dust. It was a slim folder, handwritten statements, a few photographs, and June's shoe buckle in a paper envelope. The deputies who had once searched the river retired or passed away, their memories fading like the ink on the reports. When younger officers flipped through the file, they shook their heads and closed it again. Without evidence, without witnesses, there was nothing to be done. The 1952 brought prosperity to Ashford Hollow. Factories expanded, highways cut through farmland, and televisions flickered in living rooms for the first time. The town celebrated its centennial in 1954 with parades, fireworks, and a glossy souvenir booklet that recounted its proud history. The Holloway sisters merited only a single line, tucked into a section labeled Unsolved Mysteries. Two daughters of Ashford Hollow vanished near the river in 1936 and were never found. Margaret attended the centennial parade, sitting alone on the curb with a small American flag in her hand. Her face, lined and weary, did not reflect the cheer of the crowd. When fireworks burst overhead, she flinched, as though the sound reminded her of something darker. Gerald was absent, claiming he preferred to watch from the tavern window. By then, husband and wife spoke little, their lives orbiting each other in silence. To the younger generation, Clara and June were names without faces. Their classmates had grown up, married, moved away. Only a handful of townspeople could still recall the sound of their laughter, the way their bicycles squeaked down Sycamore Street. The sisters had slipped from memory into myth. Still, Margaret kept her rituals. Every July, she lit 2 candles at the riverbank, even when no one else joined her. She placed flowers on the water and whispered their names into the current. "You are not forgotten," she said, though her voice trembled with doubt. Each year, the river swallowed her offerings, giving nothing back. The town, busy with its progress and pride, had chosen forgetting as a form of survival. Yet forgetting is never absolute. It leaves traces in whispered warnings, in neglected files, in the quiet persistence of a mother who refused to let go. What no one in Ashford Hollow could have imagined was that history itself was keeping watch. The river held its secret, patiently, waiting for the right season, the right drought, the right eyes to look again. By the summer of 2001, Ashford Hollow had changed beyond recognition, from the dusty depression town of 1,936. The sawmill had long since closed, its smokestacks dismantled and sold for scrap. A 4-lane highway cut through what had once been farmland, and strip malls had sprouted where the old tavern and general store once stood. Most of the residents who remembered Clara and June were gone or in nursing homes. The Holloway house itself had been sold decades earlier, its porch swing removed, its siding painted a dull white by new owners. That summer, the Ashford River shrank to its lowest level in recorded memory. Newspapers across the state ran stories about the drought, showing cracked earth where once water had flowed. For the people of Ashford Hollow, the riverbed was no longer a place for fishing or swimming. It had become a scar across the land. It was a county work crew, clearing debris near the rusted remains of the old railway bridge, who first uncovered what lay beneath. A backhoe operator noticed the soil give way in a peculiar way, exposing something pale. Thinking it was a deer carcass, he called over 2 other workers, but as they brushed away the mud, they saw a skull human, its sockets staring upward through 65 years of silence. The sheriff's office was notified immediately. By afternoon, the area had been cordoned off with yellow tape, a surreal sight against the backdrop of sun-bleached mud and weeds. Residents gathered on the bridge above, peering down at the flashing lights of patrol cars. For those old enough to remember, the name came at once: the Holloway sisters. The county coroner, Dr. Evelyn Mathers, arrived with her team, setting up a makeshift tent to shield the site from the relentless Sunday. She crouched in the mud, brushing gently at the soil. Within hours, a second skull was revealed, then the curve of ribs, the length of femurs. The bones lay side by side, as if even in death the sisters had not been separated. Heavy stones were still tied to them, bound with rusted coils of electrical cord. The condition of the remains stunned investigators. The oxygen-poor environment of the riverbed had preserved them far better than expected. The bones were intact, and fragments of fabric still clung to them, cotton skirts, now stained and brittle. Among the items recovered was a silver heart-shaped locket, its chain corroded but recognizable. Inside, beneath layers of mud, was a faded photograph of Clara and June, taken in their Sunday dresses the year before they vanished. The sight of the locket spread quickly through the crowd of onlookers. Some wept, others whispered prayers. The Gazette printed a special edition the next morning, with a bold headline not seen in decades: Holloway sisters found. For the first time in 65 years, the story that had haunted the town was back on every tongue. Dr. Mathers's preliminary report was grim. Both skeletons bore signs of blunt force trauma to the skull, injuries consistent with deliberate violence. The electrical cords and stones left no doubt. These girls had not drowned by accident. They had been killed and sunk to the river's depths. The river had been their grave. Sheriff Alan Keating, a man who had been a boy of 8 when the sisters vanished, addressed reporters outside the courthouse. This discovery gives us an opportunity to bring closure to a case that has weighed on our town for generations, he said, his voice steady but heavy. We will do everything possible to uncover the truth, even after all these years. Forensic specialists from the state capitol were called in. They carefully packaged the bones, the clothing fragments, the locket, and the rusted cords. Each item was tagged, photographed, and sent to the lab. For the first time in the history of the case, technology offered hope. DNA testing, unavailable in 1936, could confirm identities. Microscopic analysis might reveal traces of chemicals or fibers, linking the remains to a specific place. The town buzzed with speculation. Old memories were dredged up like relics. Elderly residents who had been children in 1936 were interviewed, their voices quivering as they described lantern-lit searches and the sound of their mothers weeping. Younger generations, who had known the story only as a cautionary tale, now spoke of it with renewed intensity. Teachers discussed it in classrooms. The Gazette filled entire pages with retrospectives, reprinting faded articles from the 1,930 seconds. At the Holloway gravesite in Ashford Cemetery where Margaret and Gerald had been buried decades earlier, flowers began to appear. Some bore notes, "We remember you, Clara," and June. Others simply read, "At last." For the investigators, however, discovery was only the beginning. The remains confirmed murder, but not the hand that had struck the blows. The question remained, more urgent than ever. Who had silenced Clara and June Holloway? And why had the truth stayed hidden for so long? Detective Elena Price had been with the Ashford Hollow Sheriff's Department for only 3 years when the river gave up its secret. At 29, she was young for the title, and her colleagues sometimes teased her for her meticulous nature. She logged every call with precision, filed every report twice, and insisted that even the smallest details be preserved. Some called her obsessive, but in July of 2001, that very obsession became her strength. The Holloway sisters' remains were transferred to the state lab for testing, but Elena knew the real key lay in the past. She requested the original case file from the courthouse basement. When the clerk wheeled it out on a cart, the folder looked more like a relic than an active investigation. The edges were yellowed, the handwriting faded, the paper brittle. A thin envelope, marked only with the word "evidence," contained June's shoe buckle and 2 corroded hairpins. That was all. Elena carried the file back to her desk and began the painstaking process of digitization. She scanned every page, enlarging the images until faint words became legible. She cross-referenced names from old witness statements with census records, obituaries, and property deeds. What had once been scattered fragments now began to take shape on her computer screen. A timeline of the sisters' final day. The map she created showed their path clearly: church in the morning, home by midday, the dirt trail to the river in the afternoon. But then the trail stopped, abruptly, as though the girls had simply evaporated. Witness accounts conflicted. A neighbor saw them laughing as they pushed their bicycles. 3 boys claimed they heard a scream. A farmer mentioned a dark truck on the road. None of it aligned. What did catch Elena's eye, however, was a diary entry, transcribed in one deputy's notes. The diary itself had never been submitted into evidence, but the notes described a fragment found among Clara's belongings, a page where she mentioned someone she called only R. The handwriting, according to the report, suggested secrecy, almost confession. The deputy had written in the margin, "Could be initials, boyfriend, teacher, unknown." And then, for reasons no one could explain, the clue had gone no further. Elena leaned back in her chair, staring at the letter. R. A single initial, dangling like a loose thread. Determined, she began searching for anyone in the sisters' orbit whose name began with R. School rosters, church attendance records, sawmill employment files, anything she could access. There were dozens of names: Robert, Raymond, Ruth, even Reverend Alden. But none of them stood out. To broaden her view, Elena began interviewing those few who were still alive and remembered the summer of 1936. She visited nursing homes, sat across from frail men and women whose memories were like faded photographs. Some offered only fragments: the sound of church bells that day, the smell of hay drying in fields, the murmur of prayers at the vigil. But one woman, Mrs. Larkin, the neighbor who had waved to the sisters as they walked toward the river, recalled something more. "They were laughing," Mrs. Larkin said, her voice trembling. "But Clara, she had a necklace, a small silver locket. I remember because I thought how fine it looked, though times were so hard. She held it often, like it meant something special." Elena felt her pulse quicken. The locket recovered with the remains. Could it be the same? And if so, who had given it to Clara? The state lab's early results began to trickle in. DNA testing confirmed what everyone already believed. The remains were indeed Clara and June Holloway. The cause of death was consistent with blunt force trauma, exactly as Dr. Mathers had suspected. Traces of chemical residue were found on the fragments of clothing chemicals used in the pulping process of lumber, the kind produced by the sawmill in Ashford Hollow during the 1930 seconds. The pieces were aligning in unsettling ways. The locket, the diary's mysterious R, the sawmill chemicals, and Gerald Holloway's long, silent shadow. Late at night, Elena sat in her office, surrounded by old photographs and brittle papers. She felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. This was no ordinary cold case. This was the story of a town's silence, of a family unraveling, of two young women lost to both time and secrecy. She closed the file, whispering aloud as though to the sisters themselves. "I'll find out who he was. I promise." The investigation had crossed decades, but now, for the first time, it had someone willing to follow every fragile thread, and the threads all seemed to lead back to a single letter: R. Elena Price had learned early in her career that archives were as valuable as laboratories. If the sisters had left behind words, photographs, or trinkets, those artifacts could speak across the decades in ways that bone and fiber alone could not. With that in mind, she arranged a visit to the Ashford Historical Society, a converted Victorian mansion on Elm Street, where the town stored its fragile past. The curator, Harold Jenkins, was a thin man in his 70s who had lived his entire life in Ashford Hollow. When Elena asked about the Holloways, his face softened with something like reverence. "Most people today don't ask about them," he said, leading her up a narrow staircase to the attic archive. "But we've kept what we could." When the Holloway house was sold in the late 40s, the new owners donated boxes of belongings, clothes, photographs, even a few journals. The boxes sat on shelves, each labeled in neat handwriting. Elena's hands trembled slightly as she opened one marked Holloway Family, 1,930 seconds. Inside lay faded schoolbooks, hymnals with handwritten notes in the margins, and photographs of Clara and June in their Sunday dresses, smiling shyly at the camera. Beneath them, wrapped in yellowed tissue, she found a diary bound in worn leather. The name Clara was etched faintly inside the cover. She carried the diary to a reading table, donning gloves before she turned the fragile pages. The handwriting was careful, looping, the kind of penmanship drilled into students of the era. The earliest entries were innocent reflections on church sermons, complaints about chores, dreams of becoming a teacher. But as Elena read further, a new tone emerged. Clara wrote of someone she referred to only as R. At first, the references were vague. R said, "He will take me home after choir practice. R thinks I am smarter than the other girls." As the months passed, the entries grew more intense, shaded with secrecy. R says, "People wouldn't understand." He says, "We have to be careful. Sometimes I feel guilty, but he tells me it's because no one else can see how special we are." Elena's chest tightened as she read. These were the words of a young woman being drawn into something she could neither name nor resist. The final entry, dated the 18th of July, 1936, the day before the sisters vanished, was the most chilling. R says tomorrow everything will change. He says we will meet at the river, and from there we can begin again. He promises June can come too, that we'll never have to hide anymore. He says we can be a family. A real family. I want to believe him, though part of me is afraid. But June is excited. She thinks it will be an adventure. I only pray Mother will forgive us. Elena closed the diary, her hands trembling. The words blurred on the page, but their meaning was unmistakable. Whoever R was, he had convinced Clara, and by extension, June, that the river would be the start of something new. Instead, it became their grave. Back at the state lab, another piece of evidence added weight to the discovery. Among the artifacts pulled from the riverbed was a small, heart-shaped silver locket. Its chain was rusted, the clasp nearly fused shut, but technicians had managed to pry it open. Inside was a tiny photograph of Clara and June, cut from a larger portrait, carefully folded to fit. On the opposite side, faint initials were etched. C.H. When Elena placed the diary beside the locket in the evidence room, the connection was undeniable. Clara had carried this locket as a token of affection, a symbol of the bond she believed in. Mrs. Larkin, the neighbor, had remembered seeing it on Clara's neck the day of the disappearance. Now, decades later, it had returned, with her bones from the depths of the river. The discovery reframed the case entirely. It was no longer just about two girls who vanished. It was about manipulation, secrecy, and a promise that had led them to their deaths. Elena prepared a report summarizing the diary's contents and the locket's recovery. She noted the repetition of R and the implication that the sisters had planned to meet him at the river on the very day they disappeared. The weight of the evidence pressed heavily on her as she drove home that night. In her mind, she pictured Clara's neat handwriting, the way her words wavered between hope and fear. She imagined June's eager excitement, trusting her older sister completely, and she thought of Margaret, sitting on the porch for years, waiting for daughters who had been silenced by a promise they never should have trusted. The diary and the necklace were no longer just artifacts. They were voices from the past, whispering the truth that had been buried for 65 years, and they pointed, with growing clarity, toward the man who had written himself into the sisters' lives with a single letter. The diary and locket had shifted the investigation from uncertainty to a grim clarity. Whoever R was, he had been close enough to Clara to give her a cherished piece of jewelry, and to convince her that the river was the beginning of a new life. But the most unsettling detail was Clara's mention that June would be included, as though this mysterious man wanted both sisters bound to his secret. Elena began contacting anyone still alive who might have known Clara in 1936. Among them was Jessica Turner, now 82, and living in a care home outside the county. She had been Clara's closest friend, though by her own admission they had grown distant in that final year. Clara stopped telling me things, Jessica recalled, her voice brittle. She said there was someone older she was seeing. I pressed her for a name, but she only smiled and said I wouldn't understand. She seemed happy at times, but other times she looked frightened, as if she were carrying a burden too heavy for her. Jessica remembered the necklace too. She showed it to me once, she whispered, her eyes distant. Said it was from him. From R. This testimony added to Elena's growing unease. Clara had not invented the relationship. Others had seen signs of it, though no one had been willing or perhaps able to act. Turning back to the courthouse archives, Elena requested access to employment records from the Ashford sawmill. It was there that Gerald Holloway had worked for most of his adult life, rising from apprentice to senior foreman. The sawmill had closed in the 1960 seconds, but its records had been boxed and stored in the county's dusty vault. The files revealed something troubling. Gerald's personnel record noted multiple complaints, couched in the careful, euphemistic language of the era. In 1935, a young female worker had accused him of improper familiarity. The note stated she left her position soon after. In 1936, only months before Clara and June vanished, another complaint described inappropriate conduct, unbecoming of a foreman. Again, no action was taken. Gerald was considered reliable, skilled, indispensable in the lean years of the Depression. Elena highlighted these passages and pinned them to her investigation board. Here was a man with a documented history of boundary violations, a man who had access to chemicals found on the sisters' clothing, and a man who had placed himself at the riverbank on the very night his daughters disappeared. Yet suspicion was not proof. Elena needed more. She searched the original police notes again, reading every margin, every scribbled line. One entry caught her eye. Sheriff Dwyer had written that Gerald was the first to discover the girls' belongings, the bicycles, and the blanket near the grove. But why had he gone there directly, before anyone else knew where to search? The weight of implication grew heavier with each connection. Clara's diary had spoken of R, a man promising freedom and family. Gerald's records showed a pattern of predatory behavior, carefully concealed beneath the respectability of his role, and the locket, likely a gift, likely from him, had been found tied to her remains at the bottom of the river. Elena returned to the nursing home to question Mrs. Larkin again. The elderly woman squinted as Elena repeated the timeline of that Sunday in 1936. Finally, she admitted, "I always thought it strange. Gerald came by our fence the next morning before the sheriff called the search. He asked if I'd seen the girls near the grove. I hadn't. But how did he know to ask about the grove at all? That single memory, tucked away for decades, aligned perfectly with the suspicion already forming. Still, Elena knew the dangers of assumptions. She gathered everything: Jessica's testimony, Larkin's recollections, the sawmill records, the diary, the locket, and compiled them into a coherent narrative. What emerged was not a mystery involving a stranger, a drifter, or a carnival worker. It was the story of a family imploding under the weight of a terrible secret, one the town had been unwilling to face. As she drove home that evening, Elena considered Margaret, the mother who had kept vigil for years. Had she suspected? Had she known? And if she had fear of scandal or retribution kept her silent? The answers, Elena realized, were still buried. But not for much longer. The web of lies was tightening. And at its center stood Gerald Holloway. The discoveries in Clara's diary and the testimonies of aging neighbors had pulled suspicion toward Gerald Holloway like iron filings to a magnet. But suspicion alone was never enough. Elena Price knew that to close the Holloway case, she needed evidence that could withstand not only the scrutiny of historians, but the cold certainty of science. She began with the electrical cords that had been recovered from the riverbed. Despite 65 years underwater, several strands were intact enough for analysis. The cords had been looped tightly around the sisters' bones, knotted in a methodical way, as if by someone accustomed to binding heavy objects. When the cords were examined under magnification at the State Forensic Lab, tiny fibers and fragments of insulation were visible. More importantly, beneath the corrosion, technicians detected preserved traces of skin cells. It seemed impossible. How could biological material survive so long submerged? Yet the anaerobic conditions of the riverbed, coupled with the protective layers of silt, had sealed portions of the cord from decay. The lab painstakingly extracted a partial DNA profile. It was incomplete, degraded, but it was enough to serve as a comparison point if a suspect's sample could be obtained. Elena's thoughts turned to Gerald's remains. He had died in 1952, buried beside Margaret in Ashford Cemetery. The idea of exhumation was heavy, controversial, but she knew it might be the only path forward. Before pursuing that order, she sought other corroborating evidence. The fragments of clothing recovered with the sisters were sent for chemical testing. Technicians found traces of lignin sulfonates and sodium hydroxide chemicals used in the pulping process at the Ashford sawmill in the 1930 seconds. It was unlikely these substances would have been encountered by the girls in daily life. But Gerald worked with them every day. The connection tightened. Then came the tool marks. Among Gerald's belongings, preserved by the Historical Society, was a set of heavy iron wire cutters, rusted but intact. Forensic analysts compared the cutters' unique wear patterns to the marks left on the electrical cords. The match was precise. The angles of the cuts, the compression of the blades, even the irregularities caused by years of use. It was as if the tool had spoken across time, naming its owner without hesitation. Elena pinned the lab reports to her board, her office walls now covered with maps, photographs, and documents spanning 7 decades. She stared at the connections. The diary naming the necklace, the sawmill chemicals, the wire cutters, the partial DNA. Each strand converged on Gerald. But to seal the case, the exhumation had to proceed. Elena presented her findings to the district attorney, who frowned as he flipped through the binder. "It's been 65 years, he said. "We're disturbing a grave based on circumstantial evidence and fragments." Elena met his gaze firmly. Circumstantial evidence led nowhere for 6 decades. We now have forensic science on our side. If the DNA matches, we will finally know the truth. If it doesn't, then we eliminate him and move on. Either way, the sisters deserve that answer. Reluctantly, the order was signed. On a cold morning that autumn, workers gathered at Ashford Cemetery. A small crowd of townsfolk stood at a respectful distance, some curious, some solemn. As the soil was removed from Gerald Holloway's grave, Elena felt the weight of history pressing in. The coffin, when lifted, creaked with age, its wood softened by time. The remains were carefully transported to the lab. Weeks later, the results returned. DNA, extracted from Gerald's bones, matched the partial profile recovered from the electrical cord. The odds of coincidence were infinitesimal. Science had spoken. The same man who fathered Clara and June had bound their bodies and sunk them in the Ashford River. Elena sat alone in her office when the call came through. She closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. For years, the Holloway case had been cloaked in rumor, distorted by time. Now, the veil was lifting, yet the truth was not relief. It was horror. The father the town had pitied, the man whose wife had mourned beside him, had been the predator all along. Still, She pressed on. She requested further analysis of Gerald's employment file, his disciplinary records, and testimonies of women who had worked under him. The pattern was unmistakable. A man with a history of inappropriate behavior, shielded by silence, whose ultimate crime had been hidden for decades beneath a river. Forensic echoes had finally answered what whispers never could. The science was clear, and now the story of Clara and June Holloway was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy, with its culprit named. When the DNA results landed on Elena Price's desk, the room seemed to close in on her. She had expected it. Every line of evidence had pointed to Gerald Holloway. But expectation is not the same as confirmation. She stared at the report, the stark black letters on white paper spelling out what generations had not dared to say. DNA extracted from the remains of Gerald Holloway is consistent with the biological profile recovered from the electrical cords binding the victims. There it was. Not rumor, not suspicion. Science. Gerald Holloway had murdered his own daughters. Elena sat for a long time in silence, her fingers tracing the edges of the report. She imagined Clara at her desk, writing carefully in her diary, daring to believe in promises that should never have been made. She imagined June's laughter on that last summer day, trusting her sister completely, unaware that trust was about to be shattered. She thought of Margaret, who had lived and died without knowing what had truly happened, who had baked birthday cakes, lit candles at the river, and set 2 empty places at the table year after year, never suspecting that the man beside her was the reason her daughters never came home. The burden of knowledge weighed heavily. Elena was not only solving a crime, she was unsealing a wound that had scarred a town for nearly 70 years. How would the community respond when they learned the truth, that their trusted neighbor, their foreman, their fellow churchgoer, had committed the unthinkable, that for decades, their silence and their unwillingness to ask hard questions had allowed the story to remain buried? She began preparing the case file for public disclosure. Every document was scanned, every photograph catalogued, every testimony cross-referenced. The binder grew thick, its contents a timeline of deception and revelation. Photographs of Clara and June smiling in their Sunday dresses, the diary with its trembling handwriting, the silver locket, stained but intact, sawmill records noting Gerald's misconduct, the wire cutters with their distinctive marks, the forensic charts showing overlapping DNA profiles. Elena rehearsed what she would say at the press conference. She knew she could not soften the truth, but she could frame it in a way that gave dignity to the sisters rather than sensationalizing their suffering. They were not to be remembered as mere victims, but as daughters, as young women whose lives had been stolen, yet whose story had finally been told. The days leading up to the announcement were tense. Word had spread that the case was nearing resolution, and whispers filled the town once more. Some insisted the killer must have been an outsider, refusing to believe Gerald could be guilty. Others admitted, quietly, that they had long suspected, but never voiced it. Old wounds reopened in conversations at the diner, in pews after church, in the aisles of the grocery store. Elena visited the cemetery before the press conference, standing at the Holloway family plot. The gravestones of Margaret and Gerald lay side by side, their inscriptions weathered by decades of rain. To the left were the small markers Margaret had placed for Clara and June, memorials without bodies until now. Soon, the sisters would be reinterred with proper honors. Soon, the truth would be known. She placed her hand on the cold stone. "It's over now," she whispered. "You'll have peace." But peace was a complicated word. For the town, it meant closure, yes, but also reckoning with its own complicity, its own silence. For Elena, it meant the end of one investigation, but the beginning of another kind of work, helping a community face the truth it had buried for too long. On the morning of the announcement, Elena dressed carefully. A dark suit, simple and unadorned, professional without distraction. She carried the thick binder of evidence into the courthouse hall, where reporters had gathered, their cameras and notepads ready. The sheriff, Alan Keating, nodded to her, giving her the podium. As she stood before the crowd, Elena felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders. She looked out at the faces, some curious, some anxious, some already tearful. She took a breath and began, her voice steady. "Today, after 65 years, we are able to provide answers in the disappearance and deaths of Clara and June Holloway. The words echoed across the room, across the decades, across the silence that had held the town captive for generations. The confrontation with the past had begun. The press conference reverberated through Ashford Hollow like a storm. Newspapers carried the headline in bold, "Father identified as killer in Holloway case." Television crews from the state capitol filled the courthouse steps. For the first time, what had lived only in whispers was now written in black ink for everyone to read. The town's reaction was immediate and divided. Some could not believe it. Gerald, an elderly man, muttered at the diner. I worked beside him at the mill. He brought sandwiches his wife made. He never raised his voice at me once. Others, however, confessed quietly that they had long harbored doubts. A retired deputy admitted, I always wondered why he found those bicycles so quickly. Never made sense. Neighbors who had lived near the Holloway home recalled details that now seemed ominous in hindsight. Gerald's insistence on walking his daughters to school events, never letting them go unchaperoned. His temper at home, muffled through thin walls. Margaret's subdued demeanor, her habit of shrinking into silence whenever her husband entered the room. We saw things, one woman confessed. But back then, families didn't interfere in each other's business. The church held a special service the Sunday after the announcement. Reverend Clay, his voice heavy with sorrow, addressed the congregation. We failed them, not only as a town, but as a community of faith. We allowed silence to protect what should have been confronted. May we learn from this, and may we never again look away. The pews were filled, yet the atmosphere was somber, a collective grief mixed with shame. Letters poured into the Gazette, some from residents demanding to know why authorities had not acted sooner, others from distant readers expressing sorrow and solidarity. The editor published them under the headline, A Community Speaks. One letter, written in careful cursive by a woman who had been a teenager in 1936, read, I sat 2 rows behind Clara in school. She was gentle, bright, and kind. I have thought of her every year since. Now, I know the truth, and it breaks my heart. But I am grateful her story has finally been told. In response to the revelation, the county council voted to establish a crisis center for victims of domestic abuse, naming it the Holloway Center. Its mission was to provide the support that Clara and June never had, to ensure silence would no longer protect the guilty. For the first time, the sisters' names became not only a story of tragedy, but a rallying cry for change. Memorial plans also took shape. The Historical Society curated a permanent exhibit. Photographs of the sisters, their schoolbooks, Clara's diary displayed under glass, and the locket recovered from the river. Visitors walked through in hushed silence, some leaving notes on a corkboard labeled, In Memory of Clara and June. A plaque explained that the exhibit was not meant to sensationalize, but to remember, to teach, and to remind. At the riverbank, a memorial service drew hundreds. Candles were lit, and flowers floated downstream as twilight settled over the water. Jessica Turner, Clara's old friend, placed a bouquet of lilies at the edge. Her voice trembled as she spoke. I kept her secret, and I have regretted it all my life. If I had spoken sooner, perhaps things would have been different. I hope she knows now that I never stopped thinking of her. Elena Price attended quietly, standing apart from the crowd. She listened as townsfolk, young and old, shared their memories and regrets. She saw how grief and guilt intertwined, but also how truth had the power to transform. This was not only about solving a case, it was about reshaping a community's conscience. For decades, Ashford Hollow had lived with an untold story buried beneath its river. Now, that story had surfaced, demanding acknowledgement. People no longer spoke of the Holloway mystery. They spoke of Clara and June as daughters, sisters, and young women whose lives had been cut short, but whose legacy would endure through remembrance and change. The reckoning was painful, but necessary. For in facing the past, the town had taken its first true step toward healing. The autumn air was crisp the morning Clara and June Holloway were finally laid to rest. The town cemetery, where their parents had been buried decades earlier, was filled with townsfolk carrying flowers and candles. This time, however, the sisters were not memorialized by empty markers or whispered prayers. Their remains, recovered from the Ashford River after 65 years, were placed in coffins of polished oak and lowered into the ground with solemn dignity. The graves were positioned apart from Gerald's, At Margaret's request, expressed in notes, discovered in her Bible before her death, the daughters were to rest together, under a single stone, free from the shadow of the man who had betrayed them. The new headstone bore a simple inscription: Clara Holloway, 1917, 1936. June Holloway, 1936. Beloved sisters, finally at peace. As the coffins descended, the congregation sang softly, voices carrying over the rolling hills. Mothers held their children close. Elderly neighbors wiped tears from eyes, clouded by age but sharpened by memory. For many, this was not just closure, but a reckoning with their own silence, their own complicity in a story they had allowed to fade into rumor for so long. A few weeks later, a plaque was unveiled at the riverbank, near the grove of cottonwoods where the girls' bicycles had been found. The bronze plate read, "Here, the Holloway sisters were last seen. Their truth, once buried, rose to the surface. May we never again allow silence to shield injustice." Beneath it, flowers were laid daily by strangers and neighbors alike. The Holloway Center opened its doors soon after, staffed by counselors and advocates who pledged to support victims of abuse and to teach children how to recognize danger and speak out. In its lobby hung photographs of Clara and June, their youthful faces smiling in black and white. Visitors paused before them, some whispering prayers, others making silent promises. The sisters had become more than victims, they had become symbols of vigilance and change. For Elena Price, the closing of the Holloway case was both triumph and burden. She had delivered answers that generations before her had sought in vain. But those answers came with a weight no evidence could lighten. Late at night, she often returned to the case file, running her fingers over Clara's diary pages, the neat handwriting of a girl who had believed in a promise that led to tragedy. She kept a copy of the final entry pinned to her office wall, a reminder of why she pursued every cold case with relentless focus. When asked by reporters what the case had taught her, Elena's response was measured but firm. Truth is patient. It waits in diaries, in photographs, in bones beneath rivers. It can be delayed for years, for decades, but it cannot be erased. Our task is to listen, to look, and to refuse silence. Justice delayed is not justice denied. Years later, townsfolk would bring their children to the riverbank plaque, pointing to the names etched in bronze. They told the story, not as a horror, but as a lesson. That silence is dangerous, that secrets rot in the dark, and that truth, however long submerged, will one day surface. The children listened wide-eyed, some frightened, others thoughtful. The legend of Clara and June had transformed from ghost story to history, from whispered warning to collective vow. As winter set in, the Ashford River swelled again, covering the cracked mud that had once given up its secret. Its waters flowed calmly, reflecting the pale sky. Beneath its surface lay no more hidden bones, only the memory of what had been kept there for so long. But memory, Elena believed, was not enough. Memory must become vigilance, and vigilance must become action. Standing at the river's edge, on the anniversary of the discovery, she whispered into the breeze, "You are remembered. You are safe now." The current carried her words away, mingling them with the water that had once been complicit in silence, but was now part of remembrance. The story of Clara and June Holloway had finally reached its end, not with mystery, but with truth. And though the sisters had been denied their futures, their voices had returned through the evidence, through the perseverance of those unwilling to forget, through the community that had chosen at last to face its past. Ashford Hollow would never be the same, and that was the point.